Hello YouTube. I want to tell you a little bit about what it's like to work at UPS. And this is for potential customers of UPS too. I spent a cumulative total of 9 years with the company. A little bit over 9 years. And they would give us the wrong start time, so we were working off the clock. Our checks would be hours or sometimes days short, meaning that they were skimming off the top and they were giving us the wrong start times to intentionally work us off the clock. Drivers would come in an hour or two sometimes before their shift off the clock to organize their trucks in order to put the stops in order and organize it so that they could make time on the route according to what the company wanted versus getting paid to optimize their load quality on the clock. I would see them get there an hour and a half to 2 hours before their shift was supposed to start to work on their trucks and organize and clean. They were rushed so bad the drivers would piss inside of their trucks on the floor in the corners rather than stopping to take a bathroom break, and they would have their lunches in the truck where there was no AC. And it was so hot in the trucks that they would sweat profusely, and some of them would have medical emergencies and have to stop and call 911 or call in sick the next day after working while sick because of heat exhaustion and near heat stroke. Loaders and drivers would suffer from severe diarrhea and other heat-related symptoms from temperatures in excess of 120 inside of the trucks, both on the outbound, preload, and especially out on the delivery routes in the spring and the summertime. They would threaten you with write-ups if you didn't load packages fast enough. They wanted you to load 300 packages an hour. That might seem simple, but consider that sometimes the packages were boxed of coupons that each weighed 45 pounds to 60 pounds. So imagine loading 300 of those in an hour, or having 2,000 or 3,000 of them come down in your truck on the outbound in the Twilight shift and just pour all over the floor, and you're expected to keep up with that. We got to the point where I was really sick of it. We were making very close to minimum wage, and after taxes it was less than minimum wage. A lot of the loaders there were. They started me out at $8.50, and when I left after more than 6 years I was only making $13.50, which is terrible. That work that we were doing was awful. They would trim hours off of my check and they would send me home after getting there because they'd be overstaffed. They would cut me and I would have to go home at expense. I was losing money to drive to the building for 30 minutes and drive home for another 30 minutes after not even getting to work. Sometimes it would happen 2 or 3 days a week. The bathrooms were often covered in piss. The floor drains would be clogged up with soot, cardboard dirt from boxes and packages getting ground down inside the facility by overloaded conveyor systems. They would put 2 to 3 people on a feeder trailer, these big 18-wheelers, and unload them in the back of the building at the unload. And then they expected 1 loader in each load, or 5 or 6 loads, to catch up on the outbound and on the preload, while multiple people were feeding heavily to supply those same loads. And the work would come down in surges. Sometimes it'd just be persistent, heavy volume, unrelenting, and it would just crush you. You'd have between 1,500 and 3,000 boxes in a big rig, one of those 80-foot trailers, and they expected you to keep up, and it was impossible. And I was just sweating my ass off the entire time I was there, in the summer, in the spring, and even sometimes in the winter. It was filthy. We had to buy our own clothes. We didn't get uniforms working in the hub. on the preload or the Twilight. We had to buy our own boots. The boots would only last about 3 months because we were walking between 7 and 15 miles a day on a bad day. That was inside the building on the Twilight shift. On the preload, it wasn't any better. We'd walk on these steel grates, and the steel grates would chew our shoes up and our boots up. We weren't allowed to wear soft toe boots or shoes. They wanted you to wear something that looked like a work boot. They wouldn't check to see if it was steel toe, but if you weren't wearing boots, they'd get pissed off with you and give you a hard time. I got to the point where I was extremely fit working there. That was the only good thing about it other than the health insurance. But if you got sick or got hurt, they would fire you, even if it was not your fault what happened. They'd demand that you come back to work the next day if you got hurt in the facility. I got a steel pipe dropped on me by one of those airport-style package car trains. It pinned me up against a piece of equipment, and I had another instance where a piece of plant equipment struck me in the head, right here. And they just didn't give a shit. I had to go to the doctor by myself, and I didn't get any time off, and I thought I was going to have to get stitches. When I got sick, after my wife died, just a few months after, they fired me. They didn't give a damn that I had 2 small children that were 4 and 7 years old. I needed the health insurance to get better, and after 9 years with the company, they canceled my health insurance and they fired me because I was too sick to work. They didn't offer me workman's comp. They didn't offer me anything. And the union, the Teamsters Local 988, didn't take care of me. I couldn't get any legal help for wrongful termination or anything, and I didn't want to go back. After all that, I realized that the union didn't care about me, and the company didn't either. It was a terrible job. I got passed over for promotions because I had small children. The company wouldn't pay me enough to afford child care, and they also would not accompany an academic schedule so that I could advance myself academically. UPS was all about the company and paying out dividends to stockholders. We had to work with broken equipment, and we had to work with equipment that was unsafe. We'd come in sometimes. There was an occasion where we came in and there was a massive pipe. I mean, huge, a gigantic pipe, like 4 or 5 inches in diameter at least, that had burst inside the building, and half the building was flooded. There was a huge amount of water flooding inside the building, going down to where the pit was at. That's the mechanical area where all the heavy conveyors are for the sort aisle. And there was mud everywhere and sand everywhere from underneath the slab of the building. And they would just let things go. They would neglect the facility, they'd neglect the toilets, everything, until it was absolutely in horrible condition, broken beyond repair. And then you'd have to wait for weeks or months to get rollers replaced that had been dropped out of the building after the trucks had pulled away with the rollers still in there. This is heavy equipment. This is the stuff that you had to use to load packages. And it was insanity. They really just didn't care about worker safety. We'd have buckets and steel pipe and all kinds of heavy metal objects, like almost like cannonballs. That's what I would equate it to. Be dropped by the sort aisle onto the conveyor system and carried to a height of 3 or 4 stories up. And then this stuff would come down like a missile into the trucks that we were working in. And imagine that being put in circulation with consumer packages that are mostly empty, that have bubble wrap and that little foam padding, foam stuffing in, little loose beads of foam. I forget what they call those things. We would have packages, by the stack, hundreds of packages a night on a bad night would get crushed because they'd be surging the volume as fast as they could possibly get out of the sort aisle. and then trying to push you to work as fast as you can to the point of exhaustion. It's a sweatshop, not even joking. And it's the UPS distribution warehouses. I worked at the one in Stafford, Texas, and there'd be broken stuff everywhere. We'd have consumer goods and people's family photos that were sometimes 100 years old. There's all kinds of precious stuff that would come through the building. And there'd be broken goods everywhere. On a bad day, it'd be stuff just pouring down because there was so much volume being pushed through the system, and we did not have the workforce. They were not pacing the volume out so that things would not get destroyed. And so people were shipping things that were precious through UPS, and we were having piles and piles and piles of stuff brought to Overgoods. This is an area that I worked in for a while, and it was having to be repackaged, and we were trying to figure out, which box did this come out of? Me and other people. Which box did this come out of? And if we couldn't figure it out, guess what happened? The consumers would never get their goods back. They'd never get their family photos back, etc., etc. Stuff would have to be shipped from the hub in a bulk box with a whole lot of other miscellaneous items to corporate Overgoods in Utah for UPS. And that's just the beginning of it. It's just the beginning of it. UPS wouldn't accommodate pregnant workers. They wouldn't give them time to pump with a breast pump. They would not give them light duty positions. They would totally fuck over the hourly workers completely as far as any kind of pregnancy accommodation. But a supervisor, they'd work with the supervisor. They wouldn't work with the hourly worker, though. It's discriminatory. And they'd cancel the health insurance of pregnant workers. They would tell those women that they couldn't work if they had any kind of doctor's restriction at all. And they would not pay them. And they would cancel their health benefits effective immediately as soon as they told them they couldn't work, which is illegal. It's completely illegal, but they did it anyway because they wanted to test to see if they could get away with avoiding having to pay for the pregnancy and the prenatal care for female workers that were at the company. And it went on and on. I was constantly getting warning letters for misloads for other workers putting packages in my trucks that didn't belong on those trucks. They would blame me for it. And I was encountering people at the hub who were hostile. I'd have supervisors that would cuss at me, even though I was a high-performing worker. And some of them would make sexually suggestive remarks to me. One of them brought up the fact that he had seen me naked at the gym to a full-time supervisor. This is two Hispanic men. And there was a lot of stuff that happened. I tried to let most of the stuff that happened go while I was working there for the sake of peace and continuity. But we had people who were in management that were unfit to work there or work for the company, or unfit to even be in supervising anyone at any job. And these people would take those promotions because there were open positions that nobody wanted on account of the fact that the company were slave drivers. What they had working there, they would hire criminals off the street, people with felony convictions and all that stuff. And you say, well, that's a good thing. But here's the deal. If you were working there, even if you didn't have any prior convictions or criminal history, they would treat you like a criminal. They would tell you to take your hair down so they could search your hair. They would unconstitutionally and illegally search your coolers and your bags going in and out of the building, especially, looking for phones, because they didn't want you to be able to talk to family or be distracted even for a moment, even for an emergency, from loading their packages. And they would wand women's breasts and ask them to disrobe in the security office. Even if you had underwire in there and that triggered their wand, they wanted you to disrobe so they could see it. That happened to my wife. She worked there. And they would disassemble your cooler, they would have you take your shoes and socks off, and they would check your shoes and socks, and they'd want to pat you down sometimes without your consent. And the guards in the guard shack would routinely violate people's civil rights. I had a guard smell me when I came in, and she accused me of being drunk. And I'm like, look, I am not drunk. I'm not. And I said, you know what, forget this. I'm leaving. The next day I came back, and there was a supervisor there waiting for me at the guard shack. The head of security. I'm like, dude, I wasn't drunk yesterday, and I'm not drunk today. I never go to work drunk, you know? And the stuff that would be said to me, the behavior of supervisors. We'd have supervisors picking up people's goods, their packages, and just throwing them violently. Threatening other workers, threatening each other, getting in screaming matches. Up and down the front wall. Swearing at each other. Raising their fists to employees. I remember this big Mexican guy who used to do that. He'd pick fights with the loaders, try to get in fights with them. It's hot as hell in the building. And their tempers would run high. And I had a guy, one worker who came in who was all tatted up, who was sitting there texting on his phone. I'm working my ass off in an extremely hot trailer. And I told the guy, look, I helped you with your load. Come over here and help me with mine. And he didn't want to do the job. He was threatening to kick my ass, And I went to HR, and they tried to suggest to me that I was harassing the other worker, this black guy who was just completely tatted up. And it wasn't even about race to me. It was about the fact that he hadn't done what he said he was going to do. I didn't cuss at him or get unprofessional with him or anything, because I knew in that environment what that would lead to with anyone. I was always civil and respectful even when other people were not. And that's why it was so offensive to me how these people would behave. Like, the job is not hard enough already without you acting like a complete asshole, And they had no boundaries with how they would talk to each other, how they behave, how they'd act. People's stuff was getting broken, TVs were getting thrown and dropped, computers, phones were getting stolen out of boxes. I'd find busted open and torn open packages where people had stolen stuff. I'd see valuable stuff going down the conveyor system, loose, where boxes or packages had been torn open by someone, and all or part of the contents had been taken. And they would have to arrest people for theft. We would have people on drugs because they didn't do drug testing at the facility, pre-hiring or while employed. They would let these drug addicts come in there, and these people were hard up for money, and they would steal. And I stayed there for the health insurance for my family. That's why I was there. But the job was hell. The people were sometimes very unprofessional. The supervisors especially. They would have full-time supervisors that would tear into the part-time supervisors, and the part-time supervisors kept trading me between different work areas because I would file grievances for harassment. I'd say, look, I'm working as fast as I possibly can. I get here when I can. I had extenuating family circumstances sometimes, and they did not have any flexibility for family or for emergencies. If anything came up, they didn't care. The company just did not care. My circumstances were especially bad, and I hated it. I hated dealing with the company. I hated dealing with the supervisors. I liked the exercise, but right up until one of my full-time supervisors got traded to another facility, he got traded to Sweetwater, it was just miserable. One hostile supervisor, we had three that I can remember that were really especially bad, and several full-time supervisors, both on the preload and Twilight, that gave me a hard time the whole time I was there. and it made life very difficult. And I didn't know what to do about it. I had a stack of grievances, probably between 30 and 50 grievances I filed in 9 years over wage theft, stolen time off my check, failure to put in our vacation time prior to us taking vacation so we wouldn't get paid when we took vacation. That was how they tried to get at you. You'd go in there and they would promise to put your vacation in. If you didn't physically see them do it, it wasn't done. And they just didn't care about any crisis you had. I remember going to work one day and my dad had just been struck and killed by a truck. And a full-time supervisor walked by and gave me a hard time about stuff being on the floor. There was a package that was busted open outside that I wasn't responsible for, but I took care of it anyway, and I was taping it up. And one of the other guys told him, "Hey, lay off this guy, man. You know, his dad just died." And he said, "Fuck his dad. You know? I don't care about that. Not one bit." That's the kind of corporate behavior that UPS supervisors and management would engage in. That's the kind of stuff they would say. That guy's name, he was on Twilight shift. His name was Keith. And he was some kind of regional supervisor, if I remember right. But it was just terrible. It was terrible. They didn't need to make the job that way. It didn't have to be that way. There was so much machismo that these guys would engage in, the attitude, the bravado, and constant temper flares, cussing, throwing plant equipment, just flying off the handle and going into a freaking, like a rage attack, you know, where they'd be throwing shit across the trucks, they'd be throwing packages, and they'd be moving around like they were really angry, just in a fury. Not out of haste, but because they were upset about the fact that they could not get the workers to work hard enough or fast enough to keep up with the insane volume that they were putting on them. I mean, if you're getting 600 to 1,000 packages an hour in a trailer because they're trying to force feed you a bunch of volume, you got 3,000 boxes of coupons that each weigh 45 pounds. They're coming to you. Nobody's going to be able to do that. Nobody can do that. And so they're paying these guys near minimum wage to load at a speed that is basically a blitz. It's almost like a machine gun firing boxes at you. It's coming so fast. And I told these people, hey, you know, I'm doing the absolute best that I can. I'm here. I set up the work areas. I pull the rollers out. I pre-trip the work areas. I pick up all the hub snakes, these little plastic ties that would go around the packages that people would get caught up in and trip. I inspected the equipment, and we would have so much broken equipment. It'd be sometimes upwards of 80 or 100 things that would be, you know, broken or damaged in such a way that the equipment wasn't working right. We'd have water fountains in the building that were in pieces because packages had struck them so much they were literally broken off of the wall and they were in pieces on the floor or on the platform, whatever it happened to be. And fountains would be hot. We'd have hot water coming out of the fountains that did work in a lot of cases because the compressor had gone out. And it was just constant. And there was nobody doing equipment audits to make sure the stuff was working. And I had to do it myself. On both shifts, I had to do it myself. And I had to send the information in as an hourly worker. And they did not want to engage in the tedium of keeping up with all these things. It continued that way for the duration of my time with the company. They would change out safety supervisors, and the safety supervisors had training that they had to do with staff that would come in that were in the new hire phase in the first 3 days. By the third day, you're out on the warehouse floor working. They didn't teach people anywhere near enough about the equipment or how to use the scanners or hazards to watch out for. There was so much stuff that people needed to watch out for. One day, we had a package that got dropped, and it was filled with pressurized acid. And the package burst, and this poisonous white acid cloud flooded the hub and just started to pour across the building. And the supervisors and workers continued to work because there was nobody in the tower to sound the evacuation alarm. And for like 10 to 15 minutes, this cloud of smoke was filling the front end of the building. And they wanted everybody to stand outside once they finally evacuated for like 3 or 4 hours. And it was probably around midnight when we had to evacuate. And I told them, no, I'm not doing it. I'm leaving. Y'all are welcome to stay here and work, but I am not staying for this. Y'all don't want to pay me overtime under normal circumstances. I'm leaving. Y'all can deal with it, you know. And special response had to come out from the fire department to contain the leak and ventilate the building and deal with that. And we had fires inside the hub. Belt conveyor motors would catch fire. A truck caught fire on the morning shift at one point inside the building while it was being loaded. And the brown trucks would always be parked inside, or they'd be parked at the side of a loading bay dock on the outside of the building. There were 1 or 2 pins that were usually located outside. They built on accessory pins that were in other areas for when the peak season volume would arrive. But it was tedious. The job was very difficult physically for a lot of people. People would fall out in the summertime, in and out of the hub. They would get sick, and sometimes ambulances would have to be called to come pick people up because they weren't dressed appropriately. They'd be in blue jeans and long pants in the summer months, which basically caused them to have a heat stroke and get sick within a matter of just a few minutes, because the second that you hit the parking lot, you're sweating. But by the time you get to the front door of the building, you'd be sweating, you know. And within 30 minutes of being inside, your clothes would be wet. That's how bad the heat was. And the humidity was extremely high. And there's so much more that I could say, but it was terrible because they viewed people as so disposable. They're doing a job that's very physically strenuous. People would get hurt, and the company would let them go, and they'd have permanent injury from working at UPS, sometimes disability. And the company would try to pin serious injury liability on supervisors that were in the work areas when those things would happen. But it was the fact that the company was pushing the volume so hard that made it such a dangerous environment. People were tempted to break procedure as far as how to move packages through the system on account of the fact that the demand to move things was so strong. There'd be just insane amounts of workflow being pushed out of those feeder trailers into the hubs and coming off the brown trucks simultaneously. And all this stuff's being sorted. You'd have, you know, on a slow night, something like 20 to 30,000 boxes or packages move through. And on a bad night, you'd have anywhere between, 90,000 and like 150,000 pieces come through the hub. It would come to the point during the busy parts of the year where the seasons would force the shifts to trade off. People would be clocking out after the next shift had already come in. And during the normal parts of the year, you didn't even see the other shift. At most of the hubs, that's how it is. But the company just treated everybody as highly disposable. There were no personal relationships. There was no respect between management and hourly workers, even if you were civil. There would be preferential treatment that would be given to certain people too. And it didn't matter about your contribution, your years with the company. If somebody was buddy-buddy with HR or with management, they would get a preferential position over you. I had a promotion that I was given where I stopped working as a loader and unloader for a period of about 6 months. And my family was depending on that extra income that I got. And they didn't tell me, hey, there's a person that's out on injury that you're filling in for. So when he came back to work, I was let go from the position that I was in, and I was sent back to loading, despite being very good at my job. I got tired of it. I got tired of being mistreated, and the warning letters, and the harassment, and the belligerent behavior, supervisors cussing at me, supervisors being unprofessional and sometimes getting violent with the packages and breaking things, throwing packages. We had so much consumer goods, so much that I can't even count it. It was innumerable how much stuff was getting broken. And we were constantly having stuff that was leaking out of boxes. Boxes were getting crushed in the conveyor system because they'd be forcing too much volume through the conveyors at one time rather than pacing it out and letting the system clear and letting everybody process the volume at a normal, sane, sustainable pace. The company didn't care what happened to the customer's goods. And Amazon would complain because they had too many claims from damaged packages and lost products. They got destroyed by UPS mishandling their goods. It was a common thing for stuff to get dropped, thrown, and kicked. Everybody did it at the company, everybody. I didn't see a single person that did not have to do that at some point in time, because things would get shipped that shouldn't have been shipped, and there was such a race to get things loaded all the time. I couldn't believe some of the stuff that would ship through there. We'd have buckets of paint that would burst open. We'd have bleach come bursting open down through the conveyor system, and it would leak. And it would just pour onto other people's goods, and their packages, and the packages would disintegrate. I don't know if you ever seen what cardboard does when it gets hit with bleach, but it turns yellow, and it turns into a liquid, soupy type of material, and everything that's contained within the cardboard just falls out, falls right through it. And the bleach would damage our clothing. It would get on the floors, and we'd be walking through it, and the trucks would smell strongly of chemicals at times, and they'd pour cat litter on it to clean it up, and then you'd have cat litter dust in the load that they would leave in there, along with broken glass and all sorts of other hazards that would be spilled on the floor and left, like those retail security devices with the tags on them. I can't tell you how many times I saw those spilled by the hundreds or thousands on the floor in some of the loads that I worked in. And they expect you to walk over it with your boots. I would be walking around, and I'd check my boots at the end of the shift, and I'd have a whole bunch of 2 to 3 inch tacks sticking in the bottom. And it was always something like that. I'd have glass stuck in the bottom of my treads. There'd be oil on the floor we'd walk through. I'd have motor oil on my shoes. I would have to take my boots off before I even entered my house, because if I didn't, I'd be chancing, hazarding some kind of sharp objects or something that would tear my floors up, or stain the carpet in the rooms that I had carpet in when I get home. Some people got in the habit of just taking their clothes off and their boots and their gloves in the parking lot, changing into clean clothes as soon as they get out of the hub, because their clothes would be so contaminated, and my clothes would get holes in them. They'd be torn in the front, especially down near the belly, from rubbing against the edge of the slides where the drops were at on the preload shift. We'd have fans that were broken, and there was no air circulation, and when there were fans, there was this heavy black and brown particulate that was coming off the packages that were sitting on top of the moving conveyor belt, just pinned in that position, getting ground down. And so you were at risk of getting black lung and other serious respiratory problems if you worked there for a long period of time. Respiratory sensitive people, you can't work at UPS. You can't. You're going to be blowing black out of your nose. I'm not even joking. It's just like working in a coal mine. And the same risk existed with falling packages too. We'd have packages fall off the conveyor system because the system was overloaded, and you're at risk of getting struck in the head or on the body from stuff that would fall because they would overstack the system above the safety railing. We had a guy that got struck in the head with a pipe and had to have, neurosurgery and stitches. He was seriously injured. And the supervisor that was in that area that was breaking jams at the time got terminated. But stuff like that would happen all the time. There'd be stuff that would happen at the hubs all the time, and they would call it a dart injury because it would be an injury where you had to take time off from work. And they didn't compensate workers. The company doctors who were on the payroll would try to dismiss and downplay injuries that you had. They did not want to take care of people. They didn't want to pay them. They would try to use coercion tactics and intimidation to prevent people from taking time off. And they were very rude to people. It was a constant fight just to keep your job, and the company wasn't even paying well. On a good week, on the preload, I was bringing home $150 a week, and on a bad week, I might bring home $60 or $70 when they were sending me home because they were overstaffed. I didn't complain. Despite this video and other videos that I've made like it, I did not complain, except when they threatened my job. I was very patient, almost to the point, where it was like people would almost say probably I needed to grow a spine, stand up to them, because they would talk shit to me. They'd be very disrespectful to me sometimes. And I tried very hard to maintain my professionalism in spite of the low pay and the poor working conditions and the unprofessional people that I worked with. But I didn't swear at supervisors. I didn't threaten anybody. I never hit anybody or anything like that. It was one of those places where you just want to get in and get out. You want to survive your time there. I felt like I was entering a penal institution. It was the same when I was exiting, the way they would search people and wand them, and the disregard for people's basic civil and constitutional rights. They would break the law there with how they treated people. The illegal searches, and the police would let them do it. Even if you hadn't done anything wrong, even if there was no confirmation of a crime being committed, they would let them violate people. That's why I don't recommend working at UPS.